You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good evening, viewers. For those of you who are joining us live and for also those that are playing back, you're here with me, Louise Marie, and this evening I am joined by the wonderful Ben Hobbis. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Louise. Great to be here.
How are you
doing? Yeah, it's been
okay?
a busy day, but I feel quite relaxed talking tonight. So yeah, it's been a good day.
So I don't know if you're okay with me sharing this with viewers, Ben, but Ben was just telling me he's had a fun afternoon doing a lot of festivities. Do you fancy sharing with us, Ben?
Yeah, so it was our year 5 and 6 Christmas party. So this morning I was delivering training at a university in a Christmas jumper, and then this afternoon I was wearing Christmas jumper 90 children year 6 plus 90 in year 5, so 180 children, disco, melting chocolate, biscuits, squash. I think good luck to their parents tonight having to deal with sugar-filled kids.
That's what it's like though at Christmas, is it? Or it's like even the same with parties. It goes in either direction. It's either like, oh, you'll go to a party and it's like crudités made out of vegetables, or it's like the sugar fest and they come back and they're like wired.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for coming on for us, Ben. Obviously, the focus of our discussion this evening is on next in line, nurturing the leaders of tomorrow. And this is something that obviously you're very, very passionate about. So before we get into that, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself, Ben, the kind of role that you're currently in and any experience you'd like to add.
Yeah. So I'm currently a primary school teacher, and I teach year 6 at the moment, lead on curriculum and professional development within my setting, and includes things like subject leadership, teaching and learning, coaching, mentoring, etc., working with the senior leadership team on that. Have worked there for nearly 3 years now. Prior to that, worked in another school as with primary school teachers, wear lots of hats. So I've been a DSL, I've been a subject leader, personal development lead. And prior to coming into education, I was actually a retail manager. So I did retail management for 4 and a bit years. And what was interesting, which I suppose links into the theme of tonight, is I very much have always in roles I've had a lot of people responsibility or people leadership responsibility. I think when I worked in retail, that's where I sort of found a love for it. And I think I was either going to go towards teaching or towards something like HR. But now, as I find out more about HR, I think fair play to them for the job they have to do. And I've also, outside of that, outside of my day job, and sort of I've done things like MPQs and things like that and qualifications, but also founded a social enterprise focused on supporting educational leaders within education to get into those roles, but also to stay in those roles, because we know how difficult it is, and to make it as an attractive role like it once was. I think sometimes leadership can be viewed quite negatively by people because they're not in a way that, in like a derogatory way, I suppose, but as in people worried about doing those roles and will I get a life? Will my life be taken as I now take on this role and things like that? So that was sort of that motivation for establishing that social enterprise as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And just so viewers kind of know how we've met, we obviously primarily met over LinkedIn. I'd obviously heard about your work you talk about the enterprise that you've kind of set up, and about the focus on networking, but also supporting staff and, like you said, the really important issue of retaining staff. So that's kind of how we met. But I think this is the first time we've ever met like face to face.
Yeah.
But it's wonderful to finally meet you. So without further ado, shall we get cracking?
Yeah, definitely. Let's go for it.
Fab. So we've got a nice mix of questions on the go for viewers this evening. We've got some that are kind of more primarily research based, but they obviously will come back down to you, Ben, and your personal experience. So feel free to weave in anything that you think is relevant. So I'm not sure how I'm going to do pronouncing. I hope I do this justice. Amina Ibarra argues that people often become leaders before they're even kind of formally recognised. And I've seen this a lot on LinkedIn, colleagues saying how to start the stepping up process essentially, and how they can, the moves they can be making in their current role. What I'm really interested in is, when did that shift happen for you as an educator, and how did it change your practice?
I think for me, like, I think I came into education always knowing I wanted to be a leader, or not necessarily like a head teacher, but wanted to have an impact beyond my own classroom. And I think that's why when I first started teaching, I worked in quite a small primary school, so one form entry primary school. And I think having that sort of previous management experience in retail, and again in retail, I'd worked in sort of convenience stores through to massive supermarkets doing different roles. And actually having, I think, so my head teacher at the time recognised that within me, that I sort of got a lot out of leading others and developing others, and things like that. And I think the biggest thing that I enjoyed seeing was that impact I was having beyond my own classroom. I could have an impact on those 30 children with my teaching, but through the first sort of role I had was leading on personal development and wellbeing provision within the school. So looking at things like student leadership, assemblies, trips, visits, all that sort of like wider curriculum. And I really, really enjoyed that. And I was in a school where there was that opportunity. And I think some people don't always get that. They go into a school but don't necessarily have the right opportunities, the right fit. And I think it's about having the opportunity to leverage that. And if you're in the right place, you'll get those opportunities. But we all know of people, not necessarily, I'm not talking about just purely education now. We know people that have been promoted to roles because they're good at their job, but not necessarily good at leading others. And I think it's really hard to actually, I think you've got sort of two groups of people. You've got people who can lead, and then you've got people who can lead but don't think they can lead. And I think it's sometimes that sort of talent spotting and noticing people and coaching and mentoring people, but also not assuming, say, in the field of education, oh, they're a brilliant teacher, doesn't necessarily mean they'll be a brilliant leader. Yeah. I think it's about, some people don't see those qualities within them, and some people do. And I think it's about having the right people around you and the right people leading you, that you can then spot that in others and sort of pay it forward and create that next generation of leaders, and in particular school leaders as well.
That's a really interesting point you've made, actually. And to be honest, I've not thought about it for a long time. This is something I looked at in my politics degree. You do a lot of philosophy, and I can't remember for the life of me what famous philosopher it was. I don't know if it was Aristotle or Plato, said actually the best leaders are the people that don't want leadership. And it ties in nice to what you're saying. Actually, there are many people out there that just are lacking the confidence or feel that they're not ready. And I don't know your thoughts on this. I mean, are you ever really ready for a promotion? And actually, it is really important that you surround yourself with supportive network. And like, for example, like your line manager, they've got to believe in you, because they should be the people saying to you, have you thought about your next steps? Especially if you're seeing talent, in members of your team. It is about nurturing those next in line. And it is a really important thing to say, do you know what? I see this in you. Have you seen this in you? What direction do you want to take your career in? And let me help you get there, and tell me what you need.
And I agree. And I think that's where the best, like, I've been really fortunate in the school I currently work in, which was a different school to where I led personal development. I've always been really interested in curriculum and passionate about sort of teaching and learning and things like that. And so I went to a school where actually the Ofsted had came literally a matter of weeks before I got the job, and had said, it's a good school, but actually your curriculum isn't sort of where it needs to be, and your subject leadership isn't where it needs to be. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So I went to that school, and I'm still there, and did my MPQLT, and then became curriculum lead. But I was very fortunate that could happen. If I'd have gone to another school that had a perfect curriculum, I don't know, not that you ever have a perfect curriculum, but a really well-tuned curriculum with very little work that needed doing to it at the time, I probably wouldn't get that opportunity. So I think that opportunity to look for that leverage, but also having people like, I got called in quite early on by my head teacher and was like, where do you see your career going? What support do you want? What sort of things are you interested in? And that wasn't necessarily a meeting for her to promise things to me, but that was just more of a fact finding from her, because I think some people, because sometimes people aren't asked, people don't know. You might have a really great teacher who really wants to, be a Senko, but she or he's never had that opportunity to say that to anyone. So actually they've not had the opportunity because they've not said, or they've not felt like they can come and ask for it. So I think it's that sort of two-pronged approach where you have those people that you need to nurture and sort of encourage and empower, but equally a culture that allows people to ask for things and to have those opportunities as well. And I think because that's probably one of the best things that, like you said, Louise, about are you ever ready for promotion? I think sometimes in terms of knowledge you are, in terms of the actual knowledge you have, like you probably get a job description, get a person spec and tick everything off, but actually to feel like a leader and be able to like operationally do those things, the best type of things you get for that is the opportunity to shadow and experience that in your current role where possible, I'd say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And this kind of ties into my next question. I think sometimes there's a worry, from what I've seen in different schools, sometimes there's a worry that, your face doesn't fit, or you don't necessarily have the working relationships with people that, particularly in SLT, if you're at middle leadership level and you're an aspirant at SLT, or if you're a teacher looking to go into a middle leadership role, your first middle, actually thinking about sponsorship from people. And I think sometimes people worry. It's not just about whether they have the skills or ability, it's have they got the connections in the right places. I mean, what are your thoughts on those connections? Are they important? How do you foster those?
Yeah, and I think it's important to have those internal and external connections where you can. So have those people within your setting that really champion you and really support you. And it doesn't necessarily have to just be your line manager. It could be other people, other leaders in the school. It could be other people at the same level as you who've had those opportunities, and you want to leverage those opportunities and see if they can sort of help you, coach, mentor you. But I do think, and it was partly the reason why I set up the social enterprise and networking, because actually within the corporate sector, there are so many opportunities for professional networking. You actually get to do it as part of your day, your paid day job, and go to like these events and things like that. And obviously with teachers, obviously I know not everyone in education is a teacher, but actually for classroom teachers, people who are based in class most of the time, you don't get those opportunities to go out and network and meet other people. And I think I've had some of the best connections I've made are people who actually don't work in my school or work in previous schools I've worked in, but people I can call upon who can give me a bit more of an independent sort of sounding board and ear, and sort of like, I want to get to this part, this point. What would you suggest? Or I'm really struggling with this at the moment. I'm trying to deal with this. How have you experienced that before? And I think it's really important where you can, obviously, in terms of doing that, obviously there's lots of great sort of networks and organizations out there that people can link to and join, but equally using something like LinkedIn and leveraging sort of social media as like professional social media as a platform is also a good way of trying to do that as well. And I know it's not for everyone, because some people don't feel like they can put themselves out there. But I think, like I said in the previous question, it's that two-pronged approach. There'll be lots of people out there for things like imposter syndrome, things like that, who won't want to put themselves forward or don't feel like they can because they don't feel they're good enough, they don't feel like they're the right person. But it's about those people sponsoring, as you said, and sort of noticing that in others that haven't noticed it themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And that's one of the reasons that I really respect the kind of, you're talking about your social enterprise that have been set up, because actually they provide really non-judgmental spaces. So you're getting the training, but you're also networking. And whilst it is knackering, going to a conference at a weekend or thinking, I'm going to put a really big LinkedIn post, and before you know it, you've got like 30 DMs flying in and you're like, how do I cope with all of these? Actually, it does take time to reply to those. But actually they're really important. And what starts out as you think are surface level connections, in 5 or 6 years' time, you've also then got job opportunities coming out of these. And in the meantime, you've also got that non-judgmental space where you can literally just vent to someone and say, do you know what, I've had this really difficult time. How would you have dealt with this situation at work? And so those networking opportunities are worth doing. Things like research ed or, conferences, like I say, even like networking online, providing that kind of that safety in that space.
Yeah, and I think that's important. It's that I think some people, it's not that they don't feel like they can't speak about things in their own organisation. It's more so that they don't want to. Like you said, Louise, they want that sort of non-judgmental and that sort of independent ear. Because often I know one of the things I've found really beneficial is coaching, and I've had coaching that I've paid for externally, and I've got a really great coach, but he doesn't work with me day to day, and he's never worked with me day to day. And it gives me that extra person I can call upon. I've got all these people within my sort of my close network of people in my setting or other schools I've worked in, but actually having someone who's completely independent, that really helps unpick without that fear of judgment and things like that. So it's really important that we can create those safe spaces and allow people to feel that sense of belonging within that space, that they can do that and speak openly and honestly to help them grow as leaders.
And it's interesting, you were talking about how important it is to kind of actually factor those conversations in, particularly if you're a line manager. I mean, at my current school, I've been blessed. One of the first things my line manager said to me was, first of all, how do you like to be led? Which is a really big question. How do you like to communicate? But also, where do you see your career going? Like, how can I get you there? And we regularly, those conversations are structured into our line managements, every couple of months to check that I am actually being supported. And I think if line managers, if we're not already doing that, do need to think about, it's not just the conversations we're having about teaching and learning and supporting our staff. It's also, we haven't spoken about this in a little while. Have you had any thoughts? Where do you want to go? How can I get you there? And it needs to be an intentional conversation, not just something at the end of the year. Now we've got game time. What do you fancy doing next year? It needs to be intentional.
Yeah.
That kind of moves on to the next bit. You've talked to us about coaching. How important is that, do you think, in nurturing? Because obviously you've got different approaches. Schools are taking different routes to CPD. We've got things like mentoring, we've got coaching. There are obviously different styles of coaching. We've got more a prescribed kind of way of doing whole school CPD. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? What's the best way to kind of use CPD to support our future leaders?
Yeah, I think CPD is really interesting because I think we're at a time now where there's lots of research available and lots of organisations that are there doing things like coaching or looking at producing resources, books, videos to help people. And obviously one of the biggest rises has been instructional coaching. I think with coaching, I sometimes, when people say, oh, I have coaching or my school are doing coaching, you sort of have to take it with a pinch of salt initially, because you need to sort of, some people say it's coaching, but it's actually mentoring, or some people say it's instructional coaching, but it's not actually instructional coaching, it's coaching with an instructional teaching focus. So I think actually coaching is really important. Like I said, it's probably been the most beneficial form of development I've had. And I think actually I never experienced coaching, say, during my retail career. I probably would have been a much better retail manager if I'd had coaching. And I think actually the thing with CPD, one of the biggest things that happens in schools is CPD tends to be done to you rather than with you. And I think rather than, and we're currently looking, myself, my deputy and head, we're currently looking this year as part of our school development plan for this year at looking at different models of CPD, because we've traditionally gone for that whole, there's a weekly slot and it's filled every week and things like that. And we started to look at coaching last year, but looking at, do we actually need everyone in the same room altogether? If we're looking at like a certain piece of pedagogy that doesn't apply to a group. So in primary schools, it's very much like, does it apply to early years? And half the time it often doesn't. And they do something, they need to do something different. Obviously in schools, in secondary schools, it might be to do with different subjects and sort of different lessons and how that works. So I think one of the things that really needs to be looked at is that CPD of, is it being done with you? Is it rather than it being done to you? Because I think what sometimes schools can do is they either are very cautious about trusting staff to sort of take ownership of their CPD, or knowing that actually you'll have a group of staff who will, read books and will read blogs and will, watch things like this and go to events at the weekend. There are equally a group of teachers who don't do that, okay? And that's fine, but actually how are they developing and how is that being managed? And I think coaching is really, really important, but it's looking at actually instructional coaching and then coaching for leadership are two different things, as one example. So I think where coaching is available, I think one of the things I found through just being sort of leading on coaching in my current school and also the work I do with the network and social enterprise is about making coaching accessible. I think some coaches, obviously, if you have external coaching, it can be very expensive and some people just can't afford to pay for it. And it's a shame because we have then a group of leaders or potential leaders who could be developed through that coaching but don't get the access to it. So there's that, obviously, that issue. I think then within schools, it's okay, if you're going to offer coaching, who is doing it, and are they actually trained, or are you just picking them because they're quite good at it? And I think coaching can help, but also it's knowing that sometimes you don't need a coach, you sometimes need a mentor, sometimes you actually need a supervisor to have a bit of supervision, sometimes you need a bit more of a consultant approach where someone sort of tells you what you need to do and comes in externally. So I think coaching is definitely important, but I think it's sort of that's one element of that wider sphere of CPD and how we can do it. And also, I think if you're someone who is an aspiring leader or a developing leader, knowing sort of what you want and sort of what you can and how to get it. You can't just walk into your head teacher's office tomorrow morning and say, I want coaching and I want a session once a month. Actually, what's that going to look like? How is that going to work? What if every member of staff walked into the head teacher's office and asked for that? And actually it's not then as manageable. But I think that key thing is looking at what is needed and also what is wanted. One thing we've also done, I think, in my current school, to think about it, a lot of CPD on leadership in education is purely about being an education leader, not being necessarily a leader. And what does it mean to be a leader? So we did a big piece of work last year where all of our leadership CPD, and our head teacher said to our school improvement partner, it's the first time we've done it like this, and it's very different, but it has been really successful. Is just looking at what is good leadership in general. So how do you have a difficult conversation, not difficult conversation with a teacher, just how do you have a difficult conversation in general? How do you strategically plan? Again, not how do you write a school development plan, how do you strategically plan as a leader? And I think it's that, because I think we have to remember as well, people come into teaching to teach. They don't necessarily, their degree isn't in teaching and educational leadership. Their degree is in sort of a subject or piece of education, a phase of education, and potentially a postgraduate qualification around teaching. They're not necessarily trained to be a leader. And I think that's where we get it wrong. If you're someone who doesn't want to do an MPQ, and actually, again, talk about accessibility with funding, that some of the MPQs aren't accessible for people without obviously paying the money. I think it's about making sure that sort of understanding of leadership in that CPD is as accessible for all. And yes, that will look differently in different contexts. But it's also, I suppose, for you as a leader, what can you do looking outwards to see what there is out there to help you?
That's interesting. Actually, it's something you've picked up on that I really agree with there, if you don't mind me mentioning, is actually it's about tailoring your CPD. It is the most infuriating thing as a member of staff to not be included in that conversation. So you go to a hall or a large, communal space, and before you know it, they're telling you definitions of things that you will have learned in your PGC year. And whilst that will be beneficial for some colleagues that are maybe early to the profession, new to the profession in their early years, but you've got some that have been teaching for like 30 years. And it's so alienating if you haven't actually assessed needs for individuals in your school. And you're quite right, it's interesting, CP doesn't have to be this whole drip fed top down approach where it's like, let's all be in a hall and let's all talk to you about this one teaching and learning strategy or this one leadership strategy, if it's middle leaders or SLT. Actually think, what does this person need and what can this person bring, and invite them to the conversation. Don't assume, and that's one thing I've learned on my MPQ, don't assume stuff, actually go and fact find, was the term that you used earlier, which I think is really important. Okay, sorry, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say, building on that comment there, I think one of the things we do forget is it's really interesting when you go into any CPD. I'm not necessarily talking about within a school setting, but also like official external CPD. We forget all the things we tell ourselves as teachers in terms of teaching students, like cognitive load, thinking and things like that, and sequencing well. And actually, we forget all that when it comes to teaching adults and teaching staff. And I think it's just really interesting that those things are not, like one of the things I read in a book recently was about, there's been so much work in the last 10 years in education on curriculum, and curriculum being at the heart of a school, and curriculum planning and cognitive science. Then when it comes to CPD, you just have you can have in some cases just a series of one-off sessions that aren't linked to one another at all. Yeah. And you just think, right, well, we're doing this for our children, but we're not getting it right for our staff and for adults. It's just mad, isn't it? Like when you think
Okay, so now is probably a good time to mention our generous sponsors. So this show and all the Teachers Talk radio shows are kindly brought to you by Hachette Learning, publishers of PD books and resources that will support great teaching and also leadership and learning in schools around the world. So do log on if you get a chance. And as I said, often we have discount codes on our website, the TTR website, so feel free to log on and see what discounts you can get. Okay, so thank you so much, Ben. So far we've talked about like the importance and different cars of CPD, so tailoring, actually the importance of maybe looking at leadership as leadership, not just leadership in education. I kind of want to take this down a different route, if that's okay. And it's something you've touched upon earlier in the discussion, and it's about the importance of well-being. Mm-hmm. We've talked about nurturing leaders from a CPD point of view, but I want to get your thoughts on the importance of well-being. So how do you spot for signs of burnout? Is it something we should be preventing? What are your thoughts in general on this?
I think well-being is an interesting one because ultimately well-being is really personal. And I think, again, we talked about, getting to know what your staff want, but actually what does well-being look like for different members of staff? We've got 30 teachers in my school. Actually, well-being for some teachers looks like, well, I'm going to leave at 3:30 every day because that's what I do. Some teachers who work through lunch, that's their choice. That's the thing that works for them. I think with well-being, it's very much, again, it's one of them things that can be done to you. And sort of like, oh, we're going to put this, I know what people joke, the yoga session on, or, we're going to put some cake in the room and that's going to fix everything. And actually, sometimes cakes in the staff room do fix a lot of things. But I think often it's about giving that well-being. It's giving a genuine forum for people to be able to talk, whether that be in groups or that be one-to-one, about well-being that what their well-being looks like. I think it's really important as well for leaders when they're strategically planning a school year to look at the pinch points. It was something we asked all of our middle leaders in my current school, subject leaders, when are the pinch points for you? So, for example, we had like our English team said, well, March is a pinch point for us because we have things like World Book Day. It's often quite a short term. We also have data drop before Easter. So for us, March is a really busy month. Whereas our ICT leaders very much, well, my pinch points are pretty much all year round because it's whenever the computers decide to die. But that affects my well-being because ultimately the English team know that March is a really busy year. If they can plan for that, I can't plan for when the internet wants to go, like all of a sudden goes down. The internet chooses to go down when that happens. And I think what's really interesting is just having those honest, comes back to having those honest conversations and giving those opportunities and no safe space. And the reason why I use those genuine opportunities for a forum is because we all know that sometimes it can feel a bit tokenistic when we do some things to do with well-being, whether it's the choice of what we do or when we do it, or some things can be quite hypocritical into sort of the timings of when we do it. So, if you're doing like a well-being activity on the last week of term, and actually the last thing, I don't want to stay at work longer, I want to go home because I've just done, a 14-week term or however long.
You need a wine at that point.
Yeah. So it's like very much that you need. I think it's again about that, but I think it's also from a non-SLT member's perspective, it's also being aware that actually leaders need well-being as well. I think sometimes it's really easy to forget, and that's where you can, when you go into some schools and it's a bit of an us and them culture, the SLT, not versus the staff, but they can sometimes be that divide. And I think it's often but we forget they are humans as well. They've worked 14 weeks just like us. They've got a lot of pressure on their shoulders. And I remember that was something we did in my last school. There was a point where it was the autumn term again, because it's always, really long term and the days get darker and all that. And we'd had like a tough couple of weeks, and our SLT had done something nice for us. I think they did like a breakfast buffet for us for like staff briefing, which we didn't expect at all. It was just sort of out of the blue. Like we went to staff briefing one day and we were like, yeah, that is a wellbeing gesture, which some people wouldn't have liked at all, but some people would like it. But then we were like, we as a staff sort of got together, like, what could we do in return to them to say thank you? And we just did like a little thing. We did a similar thing. We just got a cupcake for each of them, put them in their offices without telling them, and they walked in on Friday morning, they were there. And I know for some people, they're like, oh, that's just tokenistic, or it could be. But actually, it's about recognizing we all have well-being. And I think, especially when it gets to headship level, if you're a head teacher that's within Academy Trust, you might have people above you who can support that well-being. But actually, if you're the head teacher of like a local authority maintained school or a single academy trust, and you're on your own, or you feel like you're on your own, there might be a head teacher down the road you can call on. But again, the further it goes up, it can get lonelier. And I think it's about, in terms of that leadership well-being and sort of teacher well-being and sort of wider support staff well-being are sort of very two different things, because ultimately the things that stress you out and add to your pot, I suppose, are different. Ultimately, what stresses me out as a teacher is different to what stresses me out as a leader, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And I kind of want to touch, it's similar to the point you've made about CPD needing to be tailored. I think it's really important that leaders see kind of their team and like they recognize what stress looks like in them. So I'm quite vocal. I'm neurodivergent. I have BPD, and I've had my diagnosis since I was at early 20s. So I've had a long time to know myself and to work out my stress factors and how they manifest. So I'm quite comfortable saying, do you know what, I will stim. You'll know really quickly if I'm stressed because my foot will start doing this, or I'll start dissociating and I will literally just zone out. And you'll talk to me and I'm processing. So it's things like that. If we're talking short-term understanding, those conversations again are really important. What triggers your personal stress? It isn't the assumption. What triggers your stress? How can we prevent that? And are there any signs I need to look for in you as a team member or as a leader? So I can then action those, because if you need to leave a meeting, if you can't do a meeting at a certain time of day or a certain time, we should actually be taking those into account. And stress does look different, and burnout manifests differently in different people. And it just comes down to that relational, I'm a leader, I understand my team, and I know what that looks and sounds like for my individual colleagues. But I love the point that you made, actually, it's different for different stresses for leadership and teachers. And I mean, you've been in middle leadership for quite some time, haven't you? And you've mentioned you've done a number of different roles. What are the different stresses that you've experienced in middle leadership? Because I'm sure we've got many viewers here that are thinking about stepping up to middle leadership, and they're thinking, okay, what could the potential stresses be, and could I manage those?
Yeah, and I think that the interesting thing about that is sort of like the external, internal pressures, because ultimately, people will probably say, things like, oh, I worry about Ofsted and or results and things like that, and the things that we get measured by. But it's also the day-to-day things that I think can be more the things that we forget about and people don't talk about because they're not as measurable. So I think some cases I've sort of experienced, I think some cases for middle leadership, one of the things is I'm probably quite an impatient person. When you just want I'm impatient in general. It's a family trait. If people meet my mum, they'll see where I got it from. And I think for me, it's about thinking, right, I've got an area. I've often had quite like areas of the school that have needed quite a bit of work doing to them. So I had like personal development in my previous school, currently looking after curriculum. And I think for me, curriculum is something in my current school that we know it's good, but it's not necessarily great. It's not where we necessarily want to be as a school. And I think for me, it's about knowing what I physically can do in my capacity. I'm someone who works really hard, but I equally like to switch off I can switch off quite easily. I think as in physically, so I won't do any work tonight, for example, like physically on a laptop, but mentally, I think that's a stress where you constantly think about things. So having those activities to sort of offload and sort of decompress is really important. And I think that's really important. I think as well, often in any role, in any sector, people can be a stressor, whether that be people you lead, people that lead you. Obviously in education, it can be parents, it can be children, it can be governors, it can be, community partners. In retail, it was customers, or it could be head office and things like that. If you're in a trust school, it might be the academy trust. If you're in a local authority school, it might be a local authority. And there's all these different people. And I think it's just very much about how you then respond to those stresses. And I think some people, like I was someone who years ago would get wound up so easily by things. And I'm not a confrontational person at all. And I think it's something that you learn to sort of adjust to and learn to navigate and manage, because ultimately, if you spend your whole time stressed out, you're not going to be an effective leader for that school, that community. So it's looking at how you can manage those things. I think workload is probably the biggest stress that lots of us have. It's the one thing that I really looked at. It's partly the main reason why I moved from one school to another, because I was working in a really small school, now working quite a big school. So actually my workload is slightly different. But again, I think it's looking at what can I physically do as one person within my capacity. I can't change I cannot rewrite, say, our whole curriculum in my school, 12 subjects across 7-year groups. That would be physically impossible and quite frankly stupid for me to try and do. But what can I physically do within my capacity, and what can I get others to do or work with others to do? And I think that's why sometimes as leaders, we can go into that hero mentality of we're going to do everything, but then actually we're being a hero to everyone else, but apart from ourselves, because now our well-being is really low. Or sometimes we struggle to trust others. And so, that whole thing of, if you want a good job done, just do it yourself anyway kind of thing. But, we can't, that again, eventually you burn yourself out. And I think a lot of it comes down to that sort of that physical workload, but also that mental workload that you end up doing as a leader, whether that be thinking about staff, children, results, subjects, all those things. But I think ultimately it's very much, I remember someone once said to me, if you enjoy the job you do in the role you do, the stress actually doesn't feel that bad. If you're doing a job that you don't like and you don't feel you're very good at and you're stressed, that's where you feel you're not going to be effective. And I really think about that, like when, especially as someone who's looking to move into senior leadership probably in the next 2 years, I know for me that actually my strength are things like curriculum, teaching and learning. If I was then to be put into a senior leadership role to manage behaviour and lead behaviour, I probably could do it, but actually, would I get more stressed at the more stressful times? Yes, because it's not a thing that I have a massive passion about. So actually, I probably wouldn't be getting as much job satisfaction from it. So I think it's interesting how, and I think it's important that we talk about workload and well-being separately, even though they are linked, but seeing the difference between the two as well.
Thank you. That takes me on to my next point, thinking about, just building on what you said, workload. So we've talked about how we can look out and support our future leaders and our colleagues with regards to well-being, things we've been doing in the short term, things we've been doing in the long term, thinking about pinch points, calendar planning, that kind of thing, including people in the conversations. When it comes to, leaders that are thinking of making that next step up, whatever that might be, middle leadership, senior leadership, when it comes to workload, that is a big worry, isn't it, for many colleagues? When they're thinking, okay, I've not done this role before, and I've done as much as I can, like you say, in terms of knowledge and content. I've done the qualifications. I've done a bit of work shadowing of people currently in the role. I've reached out to those supportive networks. I mean, my biggest fear is I hope to move into SLT, in the not too distant future. And I do think to myself, gosh, it's so far removed from what I'm currently doing. And my biggest concern is workload. What advice do you have for people thinking about stepping up, and what kind of questions should they be asking? What kind of support should they be looking for if they are going to make that step?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because that's a big worry for me as well, is sort of moving into that senior leadership role and workload. And I think a lot of it comes down to when you're looking at that role, whether that be an internal role, an external role, I think one, it's looking at what do you get most job satisfaction out of, and what do you want that role to be? So I think a big thing is being a teaching leader. So actually, what does that teaching load look like? If you're obviously in a secondary school, is it mainly exam classes? So then you obviously have the workload around that. If you're in a primary school, it might be that you might be a teaching leader. Does that mean you're class-based and you're sort of a part-time class teacher and you job share? Is it that actually you're pretty much a full-time class teacher with leadership release? Is it that you are just doing interventions or doing PPA cover and things like that? And I think it's very much looking at, first of all, before going for a role, finding out what are the requirements of that role in terms of, particularly around the teaching part. Because I know for me, my next role will be a senior leadership role, but I still want to have quite a significant teaching commitment, because I want to be on the ground and to feel what it's like to be a teacher in that school, as well as being a leader. I think the other part is knowing that sort of in terms of that leadership role, what does it look like again in terms of how many duties are you doing and when are you doing it? When is your pure? I think for leaders, particularly, I'm thinking of secondary leaders. I know one of an event I went to recently, a session was all about the life of an assistant head teacher, and the person who did it, she screenshotted her weekly calendar on the screen, and she has everything on there. So she had like all her teaching classes, she was a science teacher, she had all her line management meetings, all the other things, all her duties. And I looked at her calendar and thought, when is her pure free time? So if she's not doing duties, she's not in meetings, she's not teaching, that sort of thing. And she very much said, even in that free time, I'm not truly free, am I? Because actually, if something happens in the school and I'm the only senior leader available, actually, I need to go and deal with that. And I think it's looking at how you can do that. So, and how you can look at as not just as you as an individual, but actually as a whole team. If we're talking about, say, a senior leader role, how can the whole senior leadership team ensure that a big proportion of their week is just pure time to lead and look at their area of responsibility? And I think I saw a school recently, it was a primary school, where they allowed, if they wanted to, every member of their SLT either a half day or a full day where they could work at home and just purely focus on their leadership role. And that was optional, because I know for me, actually, I wouldn't like to work at home. I think I would get too distracted if I was at home. But that's my preference. Whereas the person sitting next to me in that meeting room might be like, no, I'd love to work at home. That would be really good for me. I'd be really focused. So I think it's about, and linking to what we've said earlier, is when you're going for that role, asking what provisions are out there, but equally those people that line manage you, recognizing those times where it is really busy. So if you've got an SLT meeting, you're really burnt out and you've got loads of things to do, and you've got no agenda items on that agenda that you need to talk about, whilst it'd be great to have you in the room, do you need to be in the room? Could your head teacher say, do you want to go and have this hour to go and do this instead? And I think it's that sort of, again, two-pronged approach, you recognizing what your capacity is and asking those really honest questions, but equally then doing the people that manage you and lead you to do that as well. And I think a big thing of it comes down to boundaries. What are your boundaries? What's important to you? A big important thing for me is that in the evenings when I've had a busy day, that I can go swimming, or I can read a book, or I can go for a walk and things like that. But I plan that into my calendar. So I put in, like, tonight, I know I've had a busy day. Swimming's probably something I'm going to want to do. Equally, if I just want to go and lounge on the sofa and put my phone away, that's great as well. But I think it's about being really intentional with that well-being. I think sometimes it's really interesting that all the things that give us joy and purpose are often the first things to go in our week. So all those things that actually keep us balanced do go quite quickly. So it'd be really easy for me to say tonight, I'm not going to go swimming, can't bother. I'm just going to sit on the sofa and eat rubbish food and watch TV. But actually, it might be good for some people, but actually, is it doing the right things for you, kind of thing?
That's interesting, actually, because I was looking at something on LinkedIn the other day about different kinds of rest. And I recently have kind of been delving into my spiritual rest. Like, so I've started journaling. I remember a friend had told me that they did that, and I remember laughing. And now I'm like sitting under a tree at the weekend, watching the sunrise, listening to London Grammar, journaling away. But that's a form of spiritual rest. And like you're talking about, like physical rest and exercise actually is a kind of rest, and creative rest. Like, are you blogging? These kinds of things. And I think those conversations are really important to have with people that are thinking about stepping up to leadership, is how you actually going to balance your own personal life and how you're going to prioritize your well-being, because it is temporarily in the first few months, particularly if you're changing schools as well as doing it, it's going to hit you. Like it does. I mean, I've changed schools, 5 times now? 5 times, I've lost count. And you know, in the future there may be a move again, and every time you move schools, it's new processes, it's new people, it's new kids. And then obviously if you're then taking a step up, you've then got to think, okay, where am I factoring in time for me? Because it is only sustainable for so long that you're working until really late hours, and you're not seeing family members, and you're not doing anything that you love. And I also love the fact that you mentioned that when you're going for these promotions, ask questions. I mean, you're also kind of interviewing them. Like, if it's a role, you're going to be adding value to that. And, you know, we all know this teaching crisis. I mean, good teachers are few and far between, so good leaders. Ask the questions. I think in my current role, I sent through, before I even interviewed, I've done my look around, I sent in 20 questions before I even arrived to interview. And I'm like, prepare yourself, because I've got questions for you. And I thought, God, will they think I'm too much? And I thought, no, hang on a second. These are my boundaries. Like, I'm not going to apply for a role. I'm not going to lead a department. I'm not going to lead a team and bring in change if this isn't the right fit for me. I will ask you a million questions. And if, you know, you don't have the answers, I have to then think, is this the leadership role for me? Is this the school for me?
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting. So I kind of wanted to kind of take this conversation down an inclusion route, because I think that's, if that's all right with you, I think that's really important. And it should be kind of central, I think, to our conversations when we're talking about belonging and nurturing future leaders. And I think it's one of those elephants in the room that we are starting to talk about. You know, we've got the rise of networking events like REND and having more proactive conversations about anti-racism and allyship. And I want to get your thoughts really on, I mean, more research here. Robin Ely and David Thomas argue that inclusion is shaped by daily behaviours. What does that look like in our future leaders? How, you know, what kind of conversations do we need to be having with them? Do we need to be proactively encouraging people that are part of minority groups to be applying for leadership positions? Do we have that responsibility?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think it's a massive area of discussion. We could have had a whole episode just purely on inclusion, couldn't we?
Come back for one of those.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is, again, it's one of them things that I think, like I referenced earlier, inclusion, we focus so much of it for our children and our students and things like that. Just like we've spoken about how well-being, we really focus on students. The way we teach children versus the way we teach adults. And again, I think inclusion is one of those things that is developing within our schools in terms of for staff. But I think it's probably the area that needs the most work on, because I think some places are doing really great work. Like you referenced REND, and you know the organizations involved in that are like doing some really groundbreaking work on trying to diversify the teaching workforce and diversify the leadership workforce. There's some people that are really trying and probably are struggling. There's equally some people some organizations that are doing things that are probably a bit tokenistic and probably not sort of the right things to do. Ultimately, we've all heard of that phrase, you can't be if you can't see it, and that's really, really important. And actually some people move on to other schools and settings because they can't see themselves in that school. They can't see themselves as leaders in that school. They don't feel like they belong there. And I think we've spoken about inclusion, but creating that culture of belonging is really important. First of all, I think it goes back to something we've talked about before, the ability to have those honest conversations. So if you're in a school or a setting that isn't very diverse, I think some people use the excuse of, oh yeah, but the area's not very diverse and we struggle to attract a group of people. Yeah, but what are you proactively doing to try and bring that diversity in, whether it be through the curriculum, be through training, be through recruitment and things like that. And I think that part of allyship is really important, because you can say you're an ally or you can be an ally. I think lots of people, and I remember when I first came into education, I think I'd volunteered and sort of got work experience in primary schools that were very diverse in terms of staffing was very diverse. There was a lot of things like flexible working, there were a lot of job shares, childcare support and things like that for staff. So I actually had quite a good experience when I first came into education, and I probably sort of came in and thought, what is the problem? Why do we? What is the problem with the gender pay gap? We've got loads of women in education, like that's not a problem. But then you do some reading, you're like, oh, there's a big problem here, like a really big problem. And I think the first sort of step of allyship is that knowledge and that acknowledgement. Like I acknowledge that as someone who has got a very privileged background in terms of my identity, how can I then leverage opportunities for others? So it's one thing that I've tried to do within my, not so much my day job, but the work with the social enterprise and network I do. When creating events about educational leadership, I've been really intentional with the speakers. If we've got, you know, a teaching workforce that is sort of 75% women, 25% male, is actually reflecting that in the lineup, but also looking at how can we get more males to come along and join the conversation. Equally, when we've got, you know, only 1% of the head teachers, I think maybe 3% now, of head teachers in the country who are black or from a BAME background, actually getting head teachers within our community who are from those backgrounds to be represented at our events. And I think it's about that really, like I say, you can say you're an ally and you can sort of support as an ally, but I saw a really good article not so long ago about the different ways you can be an ally. So are you the advocate? Are you the sponsor? Are you the advisor? And the different sort of hats you can wear as an ally. Like your advocate might be actually saying, you know, or we want you to come and, you know, run this training or speak about this. But have you thought about Louise? She's really good. Like she's done all these things. Have you thought about asking her? Oh, that's being a bit more of an advocate for someone else. And sort of saying, I think she would be a real, or he or whoever would be a really good person. Or actually being more of a, an advisor of, oh, well, I've seen in other schools that they're doing this about sort of diversifying their workforce. Maybe we could look at that and we could work on that together and come up with a strategy. So I think inclusion is really important. But again, I think it comes back to, is it pure, genuine inclusion? Or is it sort of like, it is inclusion. We've painted it on the walls, but actually it's not necessarily pure inclusion.
No, that's something I really want to touch on. And it's when we're talking about diversity, this is a conversation I was having with a colleague on LinkedIn, I think a couple of months ago, and I put a post out. When you look at SLT, I don't know if it's just in the schools in, kind of places that I've worked in, I'm not obviously mentioning any particular schools in general, but it's just the area, types of schools that I've worked in. Obviously, it's a very kind of, it's only a small pool, really. I am a little bit concerned about the lack of representation at SLT level. Yeah. And it's not just, I'm not talking just in terms of like sex or gender. And I'm looking at things like ethnic minorities and representation. I think you're so right. There's this kind of element of tokenistic, let's just have one person that doesn't fit the privileged status. And it's like, then we've covered our bases, we've covered our, no. That's a really disgusting kind of approach to take. Inclusion is about respecting the different cultural perspectives that we should be hearing at leadership level. And there does need to be more than just conversation. The conversation is important. That's where it starts. Of course, that conversation we need to educate ourselves by listening. And therefore we say, actually, how are we actually promoting the leaders of tomorrow to then take these next steps? Yeah. What are we doing? And I think it's wonderful you're talking about your social enterprise, the things that you're doing. So you're getting in speakers and role models, people that have diverse backgrounds and experiences. And obviously we mentioned REND earlier, how like wonderful that is, allowing people networking opportunities, because it does, allyship is proactive, and it is going to people in your organization and saying, has anyone actually had this conversation with you? Where do you want to go? Do you feel supported? Do you feel seen and heard here? And as your line manager, what can I be doing to support you where the ball has been dropped? And that's something that has to be pushed. And I, if I'm honest, I don't think it's being pushed enough in some schools. In the schools that I see, I think it is. And I think, like you say, conversation's a starting point. I want to know tangibly what schools are doing, like how you're building, how your systems reflect representation, the conversations you're having with your next leaders, how you're supporting them when they're actually in that role. What are you doing for them? And I have met colleagues that have left schools, as you've said, because they didn't identify with the staff body. But how are we doing inclusion at a student level, as you've mentioned, and not at a staff level? How have we neglected that? Yeah.
And I think that's really important. Hannah Wilson, who's obviously done lots of work around diversity, equity, inclusion in education, she talks about, we have so much data about students in school. Like, we're a really data-heavy sector. We do have data around staff, but are we using it? Because also there is that sort of, that visible diversity, if you like, to a certain extent, but there's a lot of invisible diversity and invisible identity that we don't see. So actually, having staff, who are neurodiverse that you don't necessarily know about, staff who've got medical conditions who you don't know about, the sort of religions of staff, sexual orientations of staff, sort of childcare arrangements of staff. And I think that's where it can become tokenistic, because people talk about sort of that visible identity, if you like, what we can see or what people talk about, as opposed to that sort of invisible identity that people choose to give. But again, that comes down to, have you got a culture where actually you can be really open and honest about your identity and you can have those conversations? And equally, have you got a culture where actually, where things aren't right, can you challenge it in the right way? And I think that's really interesting. Like, some things I've done before, again, sort of mainly through the social enterprise and network thing, is when I've seen sort of education events that have got lineups that aren't diverse because of things I know about those people, actually, rather than saying your lineup's not diverse, is actually saying, I know some really great people, would you like me to put them in touch with you? And sort of being that advocate. If they choose to say no, okay, that's their choice. They've chosen to say no, that's fine. And then I can choose, well, maybe I don't want to interact or go to that event because that doesn't sit right with me. And I think you can then be an ally in that way and choose how you sort of interact and sort of advocate in a slightly different way as well. But yeah, I think the best schools ultimately are the schools that allow that. It's part of their culture that every school wants to be inclusive. But again, when we say an inclusive school, we're being inclusive for students, but not staff, or we're being inclusive for everyone. And that's an interesting thing to think about.
And I think it's really interesting how you often see the school's value system in a particular situation. I mean, in my career history, I've seen instances of, racist comments, staff have made, in different schools. I've seen and heard about these, about staff have unknowingly, unintentionally made racist comments, or sexist comments or misogynistic comments, or students or family members, and how they've then been dealt with. And you should, in an inclusive school, you should be able to say, okay, how will this be dealt with? Where is the policy? I need to see it. I need to feel heard in this process. And if there's something about that doesn't sit right with you, as a leader, you should be looking out, as we know, for your team. Have they been affected by this? What difference does it make if someone hasn't spelled their name properly? It makes a huge difference. Go and fight that battle for them.
Yeah.
You cannot claim to be a leader if you aren't going to bat for your team. It's not just, like you say, about having the positive conversations. It's about having the difficult ones. You weren't inclusive of my team today.
Yeah.
This is what you didn't do, and you pull them up.
Yeah, and I've heard of, through, again, the social enterprise networking work that I've done, these people who have got particular elements of their identity, and then they're being asked to lead on that in their school. So I had someone who I know who's a Muslim, and they had they were looking at things like Eid and Ramadan within their school, and she rightly said to whoever it was who was asking her to lead on this, she goes, I'm happy to, but why is it that I, as the only Muslim member of staff, have been asked? Why have you not asked other people? Like, why is it that because I'm Muslim that you purposely are saying that I should lead on this? Because actually we should all be leading on this. And she talked about like an instant of Islamophobia in the same school, and she goes, again, why is the Muslim person I having to do this? Because you're asking me because of this. It's a bit different. You're asking my opinion on how to deal with this, but actually it goes back to that sort of that tokenism of, we've asked that person to do it because we want them to share their sort of religion and their culture and identity, but actually they might not perceive it in that way. So it's about that sort of understanding, going back to that well-being piece as well earlier, of how well you understand your staff and know your staff as well.
Well, it's got really, really meaty, but I think it's a really important conversation. And like you say, it doesn't just stop here at the conversation level. It's things that we need to then take away from the show and be like, okay, what can I do as a leader? Yes. How am I building my team? How the future leaders, what am I actually proactively doing from this conversation? So thank you for that honesty. I really appreciate it. I know we're pushing time. Have you got time for one more question, Ben?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Again, it's another controversial one because we all know that's kind of how my shows roll. This one, what's one uncomfortable? We've obviously just talked about one uncomfortable truth with regards to things like inclusion. What's another uncomfortable truth in leadership that we are not really talking about or dealing with, do you think?
That's a really, really good question. Really good question.
Especially, just apologies if you're going to use the inclusion point.
No. I was trying to. No, I think a big thing at the moment, and I saw a tweet about this at the moment, and it's not that we're not necessarily talking about, I think we know about it, but I think a big pressure on leaders at the moment is the amount of time, particularly senior leaders and head teachers, are having to spend dealing with things like parental complaints and things like that. I saw a tweet earlier this week about, how much time it's taking and sort of that boundary and expectation piece of schools, and how parents and schools sort of communicate and work in partnership or don't work in partnership to a certain extent. I think that's a big thing that is creating a lot of pressure on school leaders, but it's not necessarily being talked about. It's being talked about within individual schools, I believe, but not necessarily as a profession. We're having that conversation of how we can manage that, because we are getting to a point where, in the rise of things like AI and ChatGPT, if I said, write me a complaint email about X, it could do it for me. And I think we're sort of losing that connection, I think, within our school communities, between our school community and our parental community. And again, it's sort of becoming a bit disjointed. I think it's harder depending on different settings you're in. It was actually a question I was asked this morning when I was doing a trainee teacher event at university. Said, what was the thing, give me some advice for managing parental conflicts and how to resolve parental complaints. And I said, ultimately, if you've got that relationship there and you allow parents to come in and they come on site regularly and there's events for them and opportunities for them to get involved, you're probably going to have less issue. But I think a big thing at the moment is the amount of time and sort of the pressure and the stress and toll sort of parental complaints and sort of issues around that are taking on our most senior leaders in our schools.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned earlier about how it gets lonelier at the top. I've got quite a few friends in senior positions or family members. I mean, my auntie's a head teacher of primary in a very small primary in Bedfordshire. And I hear a lot about how lonely it is. But yeah, it's interesting kind of having how you cope with that and how it does get lonelier and how your support system changes and how the stresses, as you're kind of talking about parental complaints, how the stresses change and how you constantly have to navigate those with decreasing time and increasing workload and increasing expectation and accountability. So what would your advice be if we wrap this show? One piece of advice, Ben, to people who are thinking about either stepping up to middle leadership or stepping up from middle to senior leadership, what would your advice be? Who should they be talking to? Where should they be going? What conversations should they be having?
I think the biggest piece of advice is to build a support network around you, whether that be not just people within your setting as well. Try and build it, whether that's through official networks, through LinkedIn or social media or, through local clusters or academy trusts and things like that, is try and build that support network in who can really support you in your development, your career, but also just someone to talk to when you've had a bit of a rubbish day or you're going through a bit of a rubbish time. Those people who can be those sort of non-judgmental people, because then I think the other opportunities will come from that, whether it's like, oh, I've heard about this job, or there's this coaching program out there, or we're going to this event, would you like to come? From having that support network around you and building that network around you, those other opportunities will come. So I'd probably say that's the biggest piece of advice: build a support network around you.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening, Ben. I personally have learned a lot, and I'm sure that a lot of our viewers and listeners back will have too. Obviously, you've mentioned a lot of the work that you've done, and I imagined we've got apologies. There was a couple of comments that came through from viewers that we didn't have time to explore today, that I imagine will want to reach out to you personally, Ben. How can people get hold of you to talk about networking and leadership?
Yeah, if you go, LinkedIn's probably the best place. So just search my name, Ben Hobbis. I'm at Mr. BH96 on X, Twitter, whatever we want to call it, on there. And we've also got a website, www.stepupnetwork.uk is another way of contacting me as well.
Okay, well, lovely. Well, thank you so much for your time and your expertise, Ben. It's been lovely chatting to you. And thank you for viewers and listeners for tuning in. I won't be here for a month as TTR signs off in about the end of this week, just for the Christmas period for a month. But we will be back the week commencing the 5th of January. So in the meantime, do feel free to reach out to either Ben or I on either LinkedIn. I'm not on X, but I am definitely on LinkedIn. You'll see me bobbing about. So without further ado, go off, enjoy your evening meals, and enjoy your evening. Thank you very much. See you later, Ben.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, everyone.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so